Berlin, May 1945. The air tasted of cold ash and boiled cabbage, a metallic tang under the sulfur of distant fires, and every step over broken glass sent a small crack like a confession through the ruined street. From the rubble of an air raid shelter, a thin light slanted across a sheet stained with old blood and the smell of coffee gone sour. They were waiting for what propaganda had promised, for vindication and for retribution, for the officers in sharp coats to appear and sort the guilty from the innocent. Instead, a convoy arrived from the West that did not fit the stories taught in school. It brought uniforms that were not the faces they had been trained to hate. It brought a small medical detachment with a battered canvas sign that read Medical Unit 12, 3rd Allied Brigade, and a calm that looked like discipline. Among the first to step forward were two figures who would become the lens of what followed. A nurse in a gray dress named Anna Mayer with bandaged hands, and a soldier in plain civilian clothes turned orderly named Thomas Reed, 28 years old and clean-cut, carrying a tin of boiled potatoes. What unspooled in the hours after those first steps would unsettle certainties and force choices no textbook had prepared them to make. Stay with this account to see how a handful of small, everyday acts revealed a truth that Nazism tried to bury, and why those acts mattered far beyond a single ruined street. The convoy stopped 200 meters from the shelter, with the sound of gravel grinding under tires and a distant trumpet of traffic stopped by the destruction. The first senses to register the newcomers were not eyes but ears and skin. Footsteps were measured, boots whispering over debris, voices low and warm against the bitter wind. A sergeant with a cropped beard and a map case at his belt spoke in a clipped voice, his English shaped by years under a command. And a young captain with a medic armband checked his watch and tapped his shoulder. The smell of antiseptic came before the smell of weapons, the tinny clang of metal supplies before the hard metallic scent of ammunition. Anna wiped her palms on her apron as the captain lifted his chin and said in German with a careful accent, "Medical, no harm." She expected a parade of suspicion and a demand for papers. Instead, the captain handed over a small white card with a printed stamp and the name of their unit. He lifted a canteen and offered water. That single motion, water to parched lips, bent the rigid line of expectations. The first exchange was not long, but it was dense with micro-gestures that mattered. "We have wounded inside," Anna said, voice thin, eyes fixed on the man who had offered water. He replied in accented German, "We help. Who needs help now?" Thomas Reed, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward and added, "We can carry. We can bandage." A medic named Samuel Weiss, dark brow furrowed, moved as if to take orders from no one, yet took orders from everyone. He spoke softly to an old woman guarding a bundle of clothes. "Madam, your child is safe here. Please let us look." The old woman, Clara Hoffman, named herself, fingers like knots, answered with a short laugh that sounded like an apology and handed the child over. The exchange that began with a canteen and a name card multiplied into a choreography of trust. Hands touching a wrist to check a pulse, a palm over a brow to cool fever, the small paper of a ration passed across a table. The shelter had practiced fear for months. It had not practiced being offered a towel or having a doctor say the word amputation and then explain the steps without fury. There were 10 short lines of conversation that afternoon, each a small earthquake. "First tell us who is most wounded," the captain said in German. "Names and ages," Anna replied, rubbing her fingers as if to warm them. "There is a man with a broken thigh and a boy with mustard gas burns," Elias Braun, a volunteer, announced. "My name is Heinrich," a prisoner said, voice raw. "My wife is there," Frau Gruber whispered. "We will not take prisoners from you," the sergeant said, firmly and then softer. "We will treat. We will register." "Why would you help us?" asked a young man named Dieter, eyes suspicious and voice small. "Because that is what we do," Samuel replied. "Because orders are to treat emergencies, and because we are human," the captain added. And there was a pause where everyone listened to the wind and then to the steady pattern of bandages being opened. These back and forths totaled more than a procedure sheet. They were a new grammar for a place that had lost its language. There were small sounds like the tin cup hitting a crate, the rustle of paper, the curling of a cigarette in a boy called Joseph who kept a fear in his cheeks, and the quiet hum of a field radio in the background. The scene smelled of boiled potatoes, formaldehyde in a bottle, and the sweet oil from a soldier's hair. The demonstration of practical care that followed was technical and humane. Medics set up a triage system on a folding cable under a torn awning, took stock of water, ration bars, bandages, morphine ampules, and a manual titled Emergency Field Surgery. They worked with a calm that read like training and a tenderness that read like habit. Dr. Samuel Weiss, Captain Marcus Vogel, Nurse Anna Mayer, Private Thomas Reed, and Sergeant Henry Carter formed a team that moved in rehearsed motions. They described to the onlookers the steps of dressing a wound and the smell of iodine as if explaining a ritual. "We will clean with sterile water," Marcus said. We will use this bandage to stop bleeding, and we will keep him warm." Anna, whose hands trembled at first, learned to lean into motion, to fold the bandage with a practiced flick, to press and hold. The noise of the street faded, replaced by the close, wet sounds of cloth against skin and the measured ticking of a pocket watch. A scene of immense intimacy played out in plain daylight. A man named Otto, who had been a baker before everything broke, tasted a spoonful of warm soup and closed his eyes. The medics handed him a paper cup, and the sugar dissolving on his tongue was a tiny defiant pleasure in the middle of collapse. The testimony of technique was not only practical, but moral. The medics explained why they sterilized with boiling water, how to recognize shock, and which signs of infection were decisive. They spoke in short sentences to families, translated terms into German, and showed, with small gestures, that procedures could be impartial. A sergeant explained ration protocols to a woman named Greta who kept asking if there would be enough for her siblings. "We distribute according to need," he said. The word need reframed everything. For a population schooled in hierarchy and blame, the idea of a rule applied to suffering rather than to labels was revolutionary. The soundscape held the clatter of utensils, the soft murmur of instructions, the coughs and low wails of pain. Sensations stacked, rough wool against skin, the warm comfort of a blanket proffered, the sting of antiseptic on a fresh wound, the bitter taste of medicinal tablets, and the dry rasp of a voice saved from panic. In that field triage, the professional competence of the newcomers worked as a moral argument against the monstrous propaganda that claimed compassion only for some. A backstory of the nurse Anna unfolded in memory as she worked, and it is necessary to understand why she hesitated and then acted. She had been born in a small town in Saxony, where her father taught her to clean wounds on the farm animals before he taught her to read. As a girl, she watched him bind a piglet with twine, a fast and gentle motion, and learned that hands could give care even in a harsh place. At 16, she attended a technical school and trained as an assistant nurse, learning the names of instruments, the smell of iodine, the discipline of shift. When war came, her brother enlisted and never returned, a gap in photographs on the mantel that her mother pointed to in silence. She had seen the propaganda films that asked for loyalty and hate, and she had sewn flag ribbons into coats, not out of conviction, but because it was expected. The winter of 1943 took her through nights of exhaustion in a military hospital where she learned to recognize gangrene by its smell and the sound of a dying man breathing. That experience left a hardness in her chest. Who logged injuries, Sergeant Henry Carter, who handled coordination with the brigade, Dr. Samuel Weiss, who talked through surgical precautions, Private Thomas Reed, who fetched water and learned to hold a limb steady while a doctor worked. Each name mattered because each named person changed how the community understood itself. The medics recorded names and ages in a ledger, and these pages became the evidence that the shelter was more than a camp of enemies and allies. They were a patchwork of human lives. The transformation inside the shelter was gradual and visible. At first, there was reluctance. The old stories clung to like sewn patches on clothing. But as days passed, small gestures accumulated. A deliberate micro-gesture had been the offer of water on day one. Others followed. A letter written in a shaky hand from a soldier of the occupying brigade to a local baker thanked him for hot bread and suggested cooperation for distribution. A sergeant named Henry Carter translated the letter aloud, and the baker, Otto, felt his chest loosen. A teenage boy named Dieter, who had been trained to spit and look away, began to sit near the medical table and hand scalpels to the surgeon. When a senior official arrived demanding lists, he instead found a ledger filled with names and little notes like "needs shoes" or "check infection left arm." And the official, unexpectedly, left with a folded ration and a promise to return with more supplies. The technical competence of the medics combined with these micro-gestures to reconstruct the moral map. Conversations became longer and more honest. In private, some women confessed to Anna that they had always suspected lies in the speeches but had not known how to name their doubts. There were 3 or 4 dialogues at night where confessions were exchanged by lamplight, and each exchange bore at least 5 sensory details: the salt on a cheek, the scratch of pencil on paper, the taste of tobacco, the scraping of chairs, and the warmth of a blanket. The crisis that tested the moral fabric came when a high-ranking local official, a man named Friedrich Keller, accused of ordering executions, was found wounded near the shelter and dragged in by villagers. His arrival forced an immediate decision. Should the medics treat him, regardless of his alleged crimes, or hand him to a crowd demanding justice? The team debated with urgency. "If we treat him, we show that medicine is neutral," Dr. Samuel Weiss argued. "If we hand him over, we become enforcers," Captain Marcus countered. The villagers wanted accountability. Sergeant Henry Carter listened to both sides, then said softly, "We will do what helps the living now and document everything." The scenario escalated into a 2-paragraph standoff with voices raised, the smell of sweat and fear, and the metallic glint of a knife on a table. The final decision was to operate under guarded watch and to record the procedure for the authorities, a choice that satisfied neither side fully but preserved a standard that the medics believed in. The operation that followed was technical and precise. The room smelled of anesthetic, the floor was cold under bare feet, and the fading sunlight fell across the patient in a manner that turned a political enemy into a human subject. Consequences rippled outward in practical ways. The ledger that Captain Marcus kept became a document that later would be referenced in tribunals as evidence that some local authorities had sought wounds to be hidden and that some civilians had saved lives all the same. Letters passed between Clara Hoffman and Private Thomas Reed, among others, were preserved. A nurse named Anna received a small citation from the medical unit for bravery in conditions of scarcity, an administrative action that did not erase the unease of some villagers, but did provide protection. Distributions of rations were adjusted with the cooperation of Greta the cook and Elias the volunteer who organized queues to include prisoners and civilians alike. Dr. Weiss trained local volunteers like Dieter in basic wound care and in sterile technique, and in doing so created a practical bridge between 2 groups that had been taught only to hate. The names of the secondary characters stayed alive in records and in memories. Cooperation here was not a slogan, but a daily practice of work and explanation. At approximately one-third into this narrative, we pause for a direct invitation to you, the viewer, because these stories do not end in a single piece of paper. If you are feeling the strange mix of relief and disbelief that many who witnessed this felt, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments what small gesture you have seen change your view of another person. Start with the words, "the gesture was," and then describe it in 1 or 2 lines. We will collect these stories and show how ordinary acts can pierce the strongest propaganda. Your experiences matter because they form a public archive of human moments that refuse neat political categorization. By sharing, you help build a record that historians and families can draw on when they look for evidence that humanity persisted in difficult times. Now we return to the scene as it unfolded over the following weeks and to the consequences that reached beyond a single town. Weeks later, the shelter was cleaner, though still scarred. The medics had taught local volunteers how to boil water for sterilization and how to fold a bandage so it would not slip. There were shifts in the villagers' behavior that were subtle and then unmistakable. Children who had peered from windows now handed crackers to Private Reed and called him by his name. Father Joseph Gruber, who once had shouted from the pulpit about loyalty, now spoke to his congregation about mercy and read aloud a line from a letter found in the patient ledger. "We are all wounded in some way." The local militia who had threatened the convoy now turned up with extra blankets. A town clerk named Marta, who had been wary of official documents, sat at the table with Captain Marcus and learned how to record injuries without it feeling like betrayal. The archive of small acts grew. A rag tied to a wounded arm, a ration shared, a name carefully written. The propaganda apparatus that had insisted on purity and exclusion found itself unable to reconcile the daily reality of shared suffering. The epilogue of this story unfolds in 3 moments that track how memory and consequence changed over time. 1 month after the convoys, the shelter had stabilized into a small clinic, and a list of names had been sent to regional command. Some stories ended in restitution, others in continued poverty. Clara Hoffman received a package with her husband's photograph returned and a note saying the man had survived. 6 weeks after the events, a tribunal referenced the ledger, and 1 local official was arrested for ordering unlawful detentions. 3 months after, Nurse Anna returned to her town and found that her neighbors whispered about her courage, but also eyed her with suspicion. She kept the scrap of paper Joseph wrote, and it smelled faintly of tobacco and lavender. 6 months after, the medical training that Dr. Weiss had left with local volunteers like Dieter and Alinus had turned into a small community clinic that treated children for diphtheria. Documents later archived at a university would refer to the brigade and its medical unit by number and name, and historians would quote the ledger as proof that on this street acts of care persisted despite ideology. These 3 temporal moments show a mixture of limits and legacy. Not every prejudice vanished, not every wrong was fixed, but new practices were seeded. In the final reflection, we must measure what these small acts meant. The story that Nazism tried to hide was not just that some of its victims or supposed enemies acted kindly. The hidden fact was that ordinary practices of care undermined an entire architecture of hate by refusing its moral logic. A bandage does not ask for identity papers. A canteen of water does not check a uniform for a political tattoo. The professional competence of medics and the micro-gestures of ordinary people made a different social rule possible, if only for a while. The men and women who acted that spring returned to lives that remained constrained. Some, like Private Thomas Reed, went home to a rigid world that did not fully acknowledge what he had done. Others, like Anna, kept the memory as a private ledger against future lies. The epilogue is mixed and human. If this story made you reconsider a certainty, subscribe for more accounts that unearth what official narratives obscure. Remember that the smallest gestures can reshape history not by themselves, but by the way they invite others to choose again and again to be decent. Compassion without fanfare can be an act of resistance. And a truth that regimes cannot easily erase.